Good morning and welcome to the Literary Sipper. I'm Amber V.D. Hill, your host. And today we're going to be doing a deep dive into summer reading and the summer reading guide that I have posted for you on my Substack, which reminds me, are you subscribed to my Substack? It really helps me out. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it would be great if you could head over there to my Substack and subscribe. It's free and it really helps me out. And of course, if you are subscribed to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, if you leave me a review, as it tells you at the end of this episode, that also helps me out and allows other people to get lots of good book recommendations, creative motivation, and all the things that you need to try to make stuff in this world. But anyway, one other place my summer reading guide appears is on my website. So if you click on my website and there's a tab that says resources underneath there, you'll see the summer reading guide for this year. You'll also see last year's as well. So you can pick and choose from both of them. And I'd really appreciate it if you did, because all of that matters in the little scheme of what I'm trying to make for myself here. But anyway, today I thought I would take you through some of the rationale for the organization this year. I organized it a little differently than I had in the past because I think that's fun. I don't think that everything needs to be a new release. I think summer is the time to stretch out and to try new things. And if you want to do a deep dive into your favorite author, or you want to do all backlist books that came out in the last 5 years that you somehow missed, or if you want to just take a poll of all of your best friends and say, what was your favorite book of the year, and read those. I mean, there's so many ways to organize it. But this year I organized it in terms of plot-driven books that I think the story is what moves and propels the story, the novel forward or book forward, and character-driven choices, which I think tend to be more literary, little slower moving, but very deep and very interesting. And so I wanted to highlight some of the ones that appear on the summer reading guide and to tell you a little bit about why I think you should read them. But I also want to highlight a couple of other things. On my Substack, I'm also going to be highlighting Tender is the Night this summer, where I will take you through the book. It's a classic F. Scott Fitzgerald novel. It's a pretty long novel, so it should, carry you through the summer and just sort of lead you through a close reading of that book. It happens to be my favorite Fitzgerald. I never really got a chance to teach it because it's such a long book, and you don't usually have that much time in a classroom setting to go through and take people through that book. But the best part is it's just a partner in a very dense book with a lot of plot points and a lot of characters to keep track of. And so someone just to sort of point you in the right direction. So if you're interested in that, again, I'll be doing it weekly on my Substack. But anyway, I wanted to highlight these, and some of them you may have already read. I mean, I tended to go through backlist books because I think they're easier to get from the library and easier to get audiobook versions of and find at a secondhand bookstore, versus the brand new releases, because I think, some of those haven't been as accessible. I found myself waiting for like 6 weeks to get an audio version of, I can't remember what book now. That's how crazy it was. But one of the relatively new releases, Tomorrow. When it came out, it took me so long to get that book from the library that I ended up buying it for myself because I wanted to read it so badly. And it is definitely one I recommend to you. But anyway, the 5 plot-driven books that I selected for this summer are varied in terms of genre, because I think people associate plot-driven books with kind of the big fat spy thriller kind of James Patterson moving forward books, or fantasy books tend to be very plot-driven by a journey or some sort of transformation. But the 5 that I chose for this summer take their genre and kind of put it on its head a little bit. And for that, I really love these choices. So the first one is The Lincoln Highway by Amor Tolles. And now he wrote The Gentleman from Moscow, which is now a television series, which I love that book. But that is not a plot-driven book. The plot is that the story takes place in a hotel, one place. This takes a story and the plot is moving forward constantly. It is a true American train story. A train across country. You've got orphans. It feels very Huckleberry Finn. It feels very classic. It's serialized. At the end of every chapter, you are waiting to go into the next chapter with a little conflict or a little end of the story that just keeps moving it forward, much like the characters on the train. It is set in the 19th century, early 20th century, and this transformation from agricultural society to an industrial one, and how that affects the children in the story. And it is very much a coming of age story, and it is very much a story of friendship and a story of secrets. And I highly recommend it for those of you who do want that sort of old-fashioned feeling in your books and not so much the modern twists and turns of technology or plots that are rife with murder and death and destruction and chaos. Although some of those things happen in this story, it happens in a much more classic American novel sort of way. And I think some people weren't prepared for that when it came out because they really felt like they wanted another version of A Gentleman in Moscow or Rules of Civility, which was his other book. But this is definitely a moving forward Dickensian tale in a lot of ways. And I really appreciated it. And I really appreciated the friendship between the boys in the story and showing a side of masculinity and a side of friendship that we don't often see in literature, except on the very basic level, that if you are on an adventure together, therefore you're friends. And in this one, there's a little more emotional substance to the friendship that you can make connections to. And in that way, I think it's very special as well. But they definitely go to tent revivals, and there's definitely old cars, and there's definitely love interests that aren't quite love interests. And you have a story of brothers as well. And I really think it's lovely. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. The second plot-driven story is called The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. And it is a true whodunit, serialized Dateline episode in a lot of ways, but with this elevated sense of art and mythology tied into it. You have a female protagonist who is a psychiatrist, and she is trying to figure out who the murderer is in a string of murders that takes place at Cambridge University. And there's a lot of the secret history of Donna Tartt. That's kind of what it feels like. It's not as elevated in terms of the language like Donna Tartt's books. You just feel like you're so immersed in every sentence. This is definitely a page turner, but it is kind of interesting what he's reaching for. And I think it's a great summer read because you can put it down or you could read the whole thing on a transatlantic flight if you needed to. And so his most recognized for his book, The Silent Patient, and he does allude to that book within the context of this book, so that for those of you who like to make connections between two books and have a reason to fit them together, he does that for you. And so it's not a sequel by any means, but the worlds collide. And so I highly recommend The Silent Patient as well. If you like this genre of sort of thriller, whodunit, Silence of the Lambs, all of those kinds of things wrapped into one. The third book is a little sweeter. It is called The Bookshop on the Corner. It's by Jenny Colgan. It is a very quiet, little, lovely Scottish, British book, and about a librarian who basically loses her job because of cuts and because she's just super into books, ends up going to the Scottish Highlands. And there's romantic interest, but there's also a transformation of self. And the reason I put it in the plot-driven section versus the character section, because even though she's going through a personal transformation, is because it is this trope, right? It is this sort of little bookstore on the corner, and she's got to go on a series of adventures to meet certain people to transform herself. And I just felt like it's not doing some emotional deep dive into who she is, and she's not having ruminations about how her life could be better. It's really about moving the story forward. Every chapter, every character moves the story forward. And it's a very sweet book. It's a very quick read. It is cozy. It is all of those feelings that I don't usually gravitate to, but there's something about the way Jenny Colgan writes that makes you connected to the characters and what happens, and the way she paints the UK is very charming, and you want to live in that world and have these friends and meet these people. And it's silly and it's funny, and sometimes that's what summer is about as well. On the flip side, back to sort of the dark, deep woods, is In the Woods by Tana French. And Tana French, of course, has written many, many books, and it's the classic cop mystery, dead body, whodunit. But I found that the way she writes is incredibly detailed, incredibly interesting characters, family structures, family dynamics, again, secrets, again, a flawed narrator, a flawed protagonist. But if you like those classic Dateline sort of plot lines, you will love this book. But it was also elevating the genre. I think she really alone elevated this genre in the last 5 years, because she's taken these sort of serialized NCIS, CSI episodes and made them darker, grittier. It feels very much like a televised episodic BBC detective story, but it also reads very deep in terms of world setting, in terms of literal setting, how she describes the woods, how she describes homes and houses, and she really puts you in the story. And so as you're trying to figure out the clues to who has committed this murder, you are also in the world itself, and you are in the woods. You are in the woods as well. So you are feeling like all of the clues, all of the mysteries, all of the intricate relationships on top of you as you're kind of trying to dig yourself out of this plot to figure out what's true and what's not true. And the final book is by Stuart Turton. It is 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. And this is a fascinating book. I really loved the premise. It might be very difficult for some people to suspend their disbelief in this story, because there is this sort of magical element to it, but it is a traditional Agatha Christie novel, in the sense that you have this woman who died, but you also, and you have to figure out how it happened, but it also the story starts over again every day, because the main character has a sort of, he does not have, but he has a sort of amnesia where every day he must start again. And I don't really want to say what the plot device is that Turton uses, because that to me is the most powerful element of the book. You will have to read it to figure out how he constructed this amnesia of sorts. But I love this idea of being set at the same party in the sort of British countryside over and over again, and having to figure out the death of Evelyn Hardcastle. And I listened to this book, and I don't recommend it as a listen, even though it was wonderfully performed and I got a lot out of it. But it was very hard to keep track of the characters without seeing the names for me as a visual person. Sometimes I find with audiobooks, I'm like, wait, who is that again? What did they say? Did they say the name, Stuart, or did they say the name Scott? And sometimes that is very hard for me. So I don't necessarily recommend it as a audible read, but I definitely recommend it as a book itself. But if you're someone who that doesn't bother, who you can keep track of characters very easily, that you're an auditory learner, it's very easy for you to keep things straight in your mind. Maybe you just put your headphones on and you're on a commute or something, and you don't have to break up the book over several days, then that's fine. But I would say get a copy of it and read it. But it is a wonderfully constructed novel and really pushes the envelope of the mystery trope. But just remember, all books are meant to be driven by the story, and some are sweet and some are more substantive. Some will be like serials, but I think they all fit into this summer category, because you have this element of adventure to them all, an elevated sense of being out of your real life. And even in the Jenny Colgan book, there is this sweetness that is you're hoping for in the summer. And with books that are a little more hard-boiled detective story, like In the Woods, it's this element of this is so not my real life that's interesting as well. And I tried to stay away from the classic summer reads where it's like two ladies at the beach meet their old high school boyfriends or whatever. And it's not to say that that's not fun and not an element of summer reading that people love. But just for me, I think I like to think about summer reading as a way to open up the purview and change the way we think about genre. So if you are going to sort of think about a summer read that is a little more about relationships or about connection or old loves or the beach, there are books like that out there. I think of My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, the Italian writer, the book in translation, very much about female friendships and love, but told in a coming of age style that is very gritty and very real. And I think you'll get a lot more out of it. So the second section are character-driven books. And these, again, are backlisted. They are not new releases. But I think it's really important to remember that recent releases can be hard to find. There are a ton of recent releases that I recommend. And if you want me to go into recent releases that you might want to pick up for the summer, I can do that in another episode. But the 5 character-driven choices I would select for you are Crossroads by Jonathan Franzen. This is supposed to be the first of a trilogy, and we're still waiting for the second book. If you loved The Corrections, you will love Crossroads. It's set in the 60s. There is an element of the church in it and like this sort of Christian element where they're right up against hippies and free love and drugs, and they don't know where the two shall meet. The sort of old guard pastor is being replaced by this sort of young counterculture perspective on Christianity, and all the teenagers are flocking to him. Of course, with Franzen books, there's always a family in crisis, and it is a beautifully written book and will transport you into this 1960s world where the world itself is at a crossroads. The second book is Danny Shapiro's Signal Fires. If you have not read this book, I highly recommend it, whether you read it this summer or in the fall. It is one of the most beautiful books I have read this year. And when it came out, I picked it up and then I just kind of got sidetracked and didn't read it. And then a friend of mine, Ayana Brown, who also posts a lot about books on her Instagram, she reminded me of this book and I was like, oh, yes, I need to finish it. And it was such a magical story. And the way Danny Shapiro uses time as a character is straight out of like Lori Moore. I mean, she just uses it in Alice Munro. She uses it in such a way that she's telling the story backwards and forwards and in a circle, and it is masterful, and it is not very long. And so in that way, I think it's even more magical to do that in such a short amount of time. I finished Less by Andrew Sean Greer, a magical, wonderful, funny book that is also very emotional. And it is the story of Les, his name is, and he is a novelist who is kind of less than popular, but just popular enough. He's not a major literary lion, but he knows them. And it's the story of his middle-aged coming of age. And I loved this book. And there isn't a chapter where you won't laugh out loud and then also feel something deep in your heart. And I highly recommend that one as well. Of course, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. If you have not read this book, you need to read it. If you have teenagers who are into video games, it will help you understand them in a way that is, I'm so grateful for as a parent, because it elevated video games to the level of art and to the level of storytelling that they are for our adolescents, and that they never were for us. I mean, when we were growing up, video games were so simple, right? Pac-Man and I don't know, Space Invaders, that dates me totally. And even when you got into like Super Mario Brothers and things in the 90s, this is elevating the storytelling genre of video games and taking you from the Oregon Trail, which many of you will remember, into the deep dive worlds of today, where it's an all-consuming life that people live, and the creators of these video games and how they have real lives and they are real people and what it is that drove them into this industry. Gabrielle Zevin is a wonderful, powerful writer, and she really brings the pathos into this world that many of us dismiss as juvenile and uninteresting. The final book is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. This might be a challenge for a lot of people. You kind of have to just suspend your need for a plot, but the plot is there, and it is told from a variety of perspectives, interconnecting stories. I loved this book. I think it won the Booker Prize. It won one of the big prizes, Orange or Booker, maybe even Pulitzer. But it is a wonderfully written story, deep dive into race, into womanhood, into the varieties of people out there, so that the American woman does not have just one story, and that there are many, many stories. And she shows about 20 of them in this book. And each one is powerful in its own right, but not in the cliched way that I think she was reacting against. And so it's very modern and it is very powerful. And I think it's a book that will last. It has lasting power. It is a classic and will be elevated as people come to know it and use it in classrooms and use it in lectures and use it as a beacon of the change of the guard in terms of literature and in terms of what we consider a classic. And I did an episode on classics not too long ago. Maybe it was the last episode that came out. And I think this is a book that, if you were making a list of new classics, would appear on it. But I think the character-driven novel and choice is always going to be my choice. They're always going to push you a little bit because you don't have the story to rely on. You have to be inside these characters. And for some people, that's hard. For some people, that's way too much real life, and they want to have a little suspension of the reality. So they go towards mysteries, they go towards fantasy, they go towards romance, and that's okay too. It's all okay. If there's one thing that the literary sipper believes in, is there's no such thing as a bad book. You will learn something from that book, whether it's what you don't like, whether it's what you love, whether it's you're not ready for it yet, whether it's rereading the same book 10 times, it doesn't matter. Part of it is about taking that time for yourself in stillness to disappear into a story, to develop empathy for either a character or even the artist who created it, and to just be in the moment. And, George R.R. Martin, the famous Game of Thrones writer, said, "A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one." What I'll be reading this summer, and these are some books that I have never read and I'm excited for, I've never read some of them because they just came out, but Kathleen Hanna from Bikini Kill wrote her memoir, Rebel Girl, My Life as a Feminist Punk. I'll definitely be reading that. As many of you know, rock star memoir is one of my favorite genres. Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. I never read that. I read Crying of Lot 49, but I never read Gravity's Rainbow. So that's the classic that I want to dive into. The Magic Words by Cheryl Klein, which is a writing craft book about children's literature, because I'm in the middle of writing a middle grade novel. The Reading List by Sarah Nisha Adams, which is kind of a book that appeared on the table at Barnes & Noble, and somebody actually bought it for me as a gift, and so it's on my list. And Stephen King's book 11/22/63, which I have heard over and over again is a Stephen King that I must read. And Stephen King is interesting because his book on writing is the classic, and it is a powerful book. And any writer who out there who has not read it, please do. But we associate him with horror books. But the books that I love of Stephen King's, I love his short stories the most, but The Talisman is one of my favorite Stephen King books. And any of his books where it's not quite horror, those are the ones I love the most. I think that's where his storytelling is really interesting to me. And this is one obviously about the death of JFK, but more than that, it's about the 1960s. And I've heard it's an increasingly powerful book that more and more people are saying is his very best. So I thought this is a good summer to try that. One of my friends is taking a reading vacation this month. She asked all of her friends for reading suggestions, and she is getting the books from the library, putting them on her phone, getting some, off her shelves or other people's shelves, and taking herself to a hotel and having a reading vacation. I think that sounds wonderful. And maybe you want to do it too. But let me know what you've read. Let me know what you think I should read. Let me see some pictures of all of the books in your bag. And I wish you a wonderful summer, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to The Literary Sipper. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new. If you did, please subscribe and leave a rating and review if you're feeling especially generous. Until next time, keep reading, keep writing, and keep putting your voice in the world. It's waiting for you.